Welcome to Hindsight Upfront Ukraine. I'm Wilson Center President, Ambassador Mark Green. Hindsight Upfront builds on the mission that Congress gave us about 5 decades ago to draw on deep scholarship and independent analysis to better understand the world around us. With Hindsight Upfront, we apply that knowledge, those lessons learned, as history is being made, not merely months and years later. This series examines key issues in Russia's war on Ukraine, an era-defining conflict touching nearly every part of the world. We've already spoken with a wide range of experts, leaders like Baroness Cathy Ashton, defense policy expert Michelle Flournoy, longtime trade representative and European observer Bob Zoellick, Turkish and German officials, U.S. lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, and many more. You can find those interviews and a wealth of other programs and analytical insights on the war by visiting our website, wilsoncenter.org/HindsightUkraine. Today we're joined by Ambassador Clint Williamson, one of America's leading experts on international war crimes, a professor at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law, and an old friend. Clint's part of a major U.S. and EU-backed effort to look into suspected war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine and help us think through the world's legal response. It's a challenging mission. The appalling images out of places like Bucha and Mariupol have prompted President Biden to call Putin a war criminal and term Russian actions there genocide. But will Kremlin leaders actually face legal accountability? And how will history view this chapter if they don't? We'll examine that and more. Clint, welcome.
Thank you.
Good
Pleasure
to have
to be
you.
here.
Good to have you. So describe a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Well, I'm leading a joint U.S., EU, UK effort to support the Ukrainian national authorities in their investigation and prosecution of war crimes. So what's different about the situation in Ukraine from many of the places where we've dealt with conflict-related or atrocity crimes over the last 3 decades is that, unlike say Syria or Myanmar, where the government was hostile to any kind of accountability efforts because they themselves were complicit in crimes, here we have a democratically elected government that has justice and law enforcement authorities and a mandate to deal with crimes that are occurring on its sovereign territory. So the international community is trying to support this any way we can. There may well be a mix of international and domestic approaches to this, but our focus is really centered on supporting the Ukrainian national authorities.
Well, and that's interesting. So there are obviously several different possible tracks. There's the ICC. Everybody knows about the ICC. There's been talk about a separate tribunal, a Nuremberg-like tribunal over the crime of aggression. But then, as you point out, there's also the Ukrainian legal system, well developed with investigators and jurists. So any of these are possible, but what the U.S. is most involved in right now is really helping Ukrainian legal authorities enforce their own laws as well as international war crime standards?
Well, I think generally the U.S. is supportive of all of these possible options. Where the International Criminal Court is concerned, they have indicated their intention to investigate crimes there, and they've already taken some very solid steps in that direction. But we have to be mindful that the ICC is a court with a global jurisdiction. Right now they're dealing with 16 situations around the world, and historically they have never prosecuted more than 5 or 6 people from any given situation. And that's just indicative of the fact that they do have this global responsibility. They have limited resources. They're not able to dive down into cases to the extent that the Yugoslavia or Rwanda tribunals were, where in Yugoslavia 160 people were prosecuted, in Rwanda 100. But even if the ICC doubles their number of people that would potentially be prosecuted, say, arising from the Ukraine conflict, we're still only talking about 10 or 12 people. So you have a huge number that are of potential perpetrators that are going to fall below that threshold level of ICC prosecution.
And the Ukrainian prosecutor general has talked about 5, 7, 9,000 potential cases. So 10 doesn't really get you all that far.
It's a small number. But this is what the ICC was set up to do. It was to go after those ultimately most responsible, the senior political and military officials that might be culpable of crimes. And ideally, that's what they would be able to do here. But the ICC has always operated on this concept of complementarity, that it really is a court of last resort. And the first recourse, when it's possible, is to use domestic authorities to deal with these crimes. As we were saying a minute ago, this is somewhat unique because here you actually have domestic authorities that are capable of investigating these crimes as the conflict is ongoing and hopefully prosecuting many of these cases. The other tribunal options that have been discussed, I would love to see some of these progress, but I think this is going to be challenging. It'd be very difficult to do something under the United Nations, even if you have a General Assembly vote supportive of this. It's hard to do things in the UN if you have 2 of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council opposed, because the Secretariat will have difficulty kind of implementing it at that point.
If we're looking at the ICC and again a potential Nuremberg-like tribunal, what would the timeline be before we would actually see judgments and prosecutions and judgment? That's a ways off.
It would be, and I think we need to be realistic that it's probably unlikely unless there is a change to a more rule of law oriented government in Russia that anyone who is indicted by the ICC would actually be surrendered for trial. Right. And the ICC does not allow trials in absentia. So you might have a situation where senior Russian officials were indicted. It would reinforce their pariah status. It would be very difficult for them to travel. It would be very difficult for them to engage on the world stage if they were indicted war criminals, but probably unlikely that they're going to end up in the dock anytime soon. That said, when I was at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, I led the investigation into Slobodan Milosevic's conduct in Kosovo and drafted the first indictment against him. And this was in 1999. At that point, very few people thought we would ever get him into custody. Right. 2 years later, there was this change of government in Serbia. They surrendered him, and he was eventually put on trial in The Hague. So strange things can happen, but I don't think that we should count on that in the short term, at least.
The world leaders who have come together behind this tribunal model point to the crime of aggression. Now, some have said that's not technically a war crime because it actually occurs before the war. So it doesn't necessarily rule out anything else that's being done, but it is a very specific and almost an obscure crime, right?
Yeah, it's we tend to use the word war crimes in a broader sense than the actual technical legal definition. There are really 3 categories of atrocity crimes that we deal with. So war crimes arise from grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. This really has to do with treatment of civilians or military personnel who are no longer able to fight. So people who are wounded, prisoners of war, that type of thing. Then you have crimes against humanity, and then genocide, of course. So as I say, we tend to use war crimes to describe all of it, but there really are these specific categories. And both genocide and crimes against humanity need not even happen in a situation of armed conflict. They can happen outside that. So the crime of aggression fits into this broader category of violations of international humanitarian law. And it has been a somewhat controversial provision. And with the International Criminal Court, there was not even a definition of it that could be agreed on when the Rome Treaty was signed. So it took follow-on discussions before that was actually agreed.
And as we're talking, of course, there's already been a prosecution now in Ukraine. We've had the first case. And so a domestic court, like the three-judge court in Ukraine, can sit on war crimes, because it was actually a war crime for which this young man was convicted.
Yes, absolutely. So the Ukrainian law needs to be amended to bring it into compliance with the full body of international humanitarian law. But there are certain provisions that can be prosecuted there. And I think what we're seeing right now are these low-level perpers. These are individual perpetrators that are
21-year-old
Russian soldier who killed an elderly man as he was on the side of the road. These are what we often refer to in this field as the trigger puller cases.
Yeah.
These are one perpetrator, one victim, or maybe two or three victims, something like that. So these types of cases, these prosecutions, are not markedly different from what would go on in a domestic court anyway. It would be very similar to a homicide case that might be prosecuted, here in Washington, D.C. What is different when you start dealing, and I'm sorry, just to back up a bit, these types of cases have been dealt with by the Ukrainians since 2014 because of the situation of this, the conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk, and they have been investigating those types of crimes. What is different about this is when you get into a situation of large-scale conflict, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify individual perpetrators.
Yeah.
So, for example, where we had these widespread crimes in Bucha and Irpin, you then try to focus more on which military unit was involved. And it's required that you integrate into this whole prosecutorial approach quite sophisticated military analysis where you're trying to figure out the order of battle. Who was the company commander, the battalion commander, brigade commander? You go up the chain of command and try to develop this linkage evidence, which then fits together with the crime-based evidence. And generally, you tend to prosecute, certainly in the international fora, the more senior people, the brigade commander, the division commander level, and up.
And that's really interesting. So, and I want to get to that because I think it raises some really interesting issues. But so just to be clear, so in the case of this young man who was prosecuted, he's apparently being sentenced to life in prison. So just because it's in Ukraine and not in The Hague, you still have the full range of penalties up to and including life in prison.
That's correct. Yes. So but it is going to be. It has to be consistent with the provisions under Ukrainian law.
Right. And it is interesting, and you point out that, ironically, because of the nature of Putin's aggression and the conflict, they've actually been at this since 2014. It's interesting. It's a well-developed area. I know we had spoken previously that one of the challenges going with a separate tribunal is actually having to create the infrastructure. In this case, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they've had to be at this for 8 years.
Yeah, and this is so the Ukrainians have these capabilities. The Office of the Prosecutor General, with whom we're working very closely, has a dedicated war crimes unit that have been dealing with these cases. They have regional prosecutors in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Crimea prosecutor's office that had relocated to Kherson. So they had been doing these cases. What has happened now, though, is because the conflict has become much more widespread, a lot of the regional prosecutors in places like Kharkiv and Kyiv even, these crimes that happened in Bucha and Irpin, resulted in just one massive crime scene in these northwestern suburbs. These regional prosecutors who really have not had to deal with these cases are now dealing with an overwhelming situation and having to address these cases. But in terms of the standing up international capabilities, and you had asked this a moment ago, a couple of things I think that we need to be aware of. With the International Criminal Court, they really have not ever mounted a real-time response as a conflict was ongoing. So for the ICC, this is something a little bit new as well. But I think they're doing a fantastic job. They have been getting resources. They've asked states parties to provide people. They've had people on the ground. I know they intend to have an office up and running in Kyiv relatively soon. But it still takes some time to stand this up. When I was at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, I led the investigative efforts during the war in Kosovo, which ended up resulting in this indictment against Milosevic. And we were operating from Albania and Macedonia as the conflict was ongoing. But the ICTY already had all of these capabilities in place. We had translators who spoke the language. We had investigators, prosecutors, military analysts there. The ICC has some of this, but they have generally been dedicated to other cases. So their ability to respond as quickly as the Yugoslavia Tribunal did is not really there. But then when you get into the possibility of creating an entirely new tribunal, this can take years. And it's unlikely that you would see something in place anytime soon, if you can even get the political agreement to do that. Yeah.
Well, and so let's talk about gathering of evidence. So I know that you've had a number of trips out to the region, been to Warsaw a number of times, but this has sometimes been called the TikTok war, right? So everybody's got a handheld, everybody's taking video, everybody's taking pictures. The government of Ukraine has even created websites for people to upload pictures. But is all of that admissible in court?
It's a good question. And, this is a very different dynamic than what existed when I first started working in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. There were no cell phones at that time. There was no social media. Now everyone has a cell phone. And so in many ways, it is a force multiplier of your investigative efforts. Everyone can become a pseudo-investigator by recording events contemporaneously. And so the positive side of this is that it gives you a tremendous amount of additional information that we might not have had in the past. The negative side is it gives you a tremendous amount of information that we didn't have, and you have to manage it. And so this becomes a daunting task of just trying to document what's out there, to catalog it in a way that's usable, and to the point you just made, to verify it, which can sometimes be difficult. There are certain apps that are there that allow for pinpointing locations and date and time, but still there is going to be a huge amount of information that is going to have to be filtered, and ultimately much of it probably will not be usable. But one thing that it does do is often corroborate information you have otherwise. It may not stand alone as conclusive evidence, but it can provide very compelling corroboration.
So also interesting when you think about how long conflicts have been going on, Russia, Ukraine. Back in 2014, if I'm correct, was the first real use of satellite data as part of the judgment on the Malaysia aircraft. So I'm assuming that everything's changed so much since then that satellite data is being used routinely now. That must be part of the evidence that you're looking at.
Yeah, again, we did use it in the Yugoslavia Tribunal. It's been used in some of the other courts. But once more, where we've had really a sea change is that back in the 1990s or early 2000s, satellite imagery was really the exclusive province of governments. It was intelligence agencies, militaries that had satellites, and it was much more complicated to use this in court, because oftentimes when you're using something for evidentiary purposes, it's fair game to explore the sources and the methodology for how this was obtained. And understandably, intelligence agencies, military forces are reluctant to do that. Yeah. So what is different now is that there's so much more commercial imagery that's out there. So information that perhaps governments might still obtain and do obtain might be used as lead information to steer you toward commercial imagery that could be used and applied with a lot less constraints, a lot less of the constraints than you would have in using government information.
And I've been reading about the CSI Armies, the armies of forensics, that forensic experts that are going into the field and also doing, Russians pull out of an area and the forensic experts come in. I know it's dangerous. There are landmines and booby traps, but I've got to imagine the work they're doing is absolutely crucial to what you're looking at.
It is. But I think that the challenge here is making sure that this is all done in a coordinated fashion. There are so many people that are engaging on this, and I don't question people's motivations.
Right.
I think people are motivated to try to help and to do the right thing. But it's very important whether it's in collection of forensic evidence, and sometimes even journalists will go to a site and see something and pick it up, thinking, oh, this would be great for a news piece that I'm doing. But you're disturbing evidence that could potentially be used. Likewise, I don't want to say amateurish, but people that are not part of the criminal justice process who are out there trying to collect evidence, if it's not done in the right way, you make it very difficult to use. On the same page, there are also a number of documentation efforts that are underway where people are interviewing potential victims. And the concern there is that you're not re-traumatizing victims or witnesses by taking a statement just for documentation purposes that really is not usable in a prosecution later. And so these same people have to give statements again. So it's very important to kind of get a handle on all of this and make sure that all of these efforts are coordinated, that they're actually being done in conjunction with either the national authorities or some of the international efforts that are underway.
Does all of this, does the abundance of evidence, again, whether it's admissible or not, but just the sheer volume of images and all that we see, what about going up the food chain? Of course, everyone here is not so much interested in that 21-year-old who pulled the trigger. They want to go after him, but they're after the Kremlin.
Yeah.
Does this help or hurt in that process? And, in all honesty, how realistic is it that they're going to go after the Kremlin?
You really need both pieces of this. So the development of the crime-based evidence is crucial, and that is the facts about, like the 21-year-old soldier killing this man walking down the street, rapes that are occurring in Bucha, even looting of stores, in Irpin or whatever, the bombing of the theater in Mariupol. All of these things fit together to create, for lack of a better word, sort of a database of all of the crimes that are occurring. So when the prosecutor general refers to these thousands of cases, this is what she's talking about. These are all of these individual incidents that together make up the crime base. The linkage evidence, taking it up the chain of command, is almost a separate process, but it is connecting these crimes or groups of crimes to people up the command chain. And ultimately this can go up to the highest political and military leaders. I think when I look at the statements that have come out of the Kremlin, for example, President Putin awarding medals to the unit that was in Bucha, this is pretty inculpatory. Sure. All of that feeds together. You can look at that, you can use that and try to build these cases. So I think they're the challenges are not going to be so much in building cases against them, but as we said earlier, maybe in getting people into custody and actually prosecuting them.
Yeah. So you've made several trips. Describe briefly what you actually do when you go on behalf of the State Department to Warsaw. You're interviewing people, you're training people, Ukrainian.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be somewhat circumspect about some of what we're doing, and particularly because we're very mindful of the security, particularly of our Ukrainian counterparts. But we're really engaging with the Ukrainian authorities. I've already talked a little bit about my experience working at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. We have brought a number of people into this process who have similar expertise, working in the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the Sierra Leone Court, the International Criminal Court, people who have done these types of investigations and prosecutions, military analysts, other specialties that can assist the Ukrainians as they're broadening the scope of their investigations. As I said, they're quite capable, and they actually have been doing this for a number of years. What is different for them now is the scale on which they're doing, the complexity of these much broader cases, and the need to integrate the command responsibility piece into it. So this is where we're trying to help. So we're really engaging with the Ukrainian authorities. We've been in southeastern Poland, very close to the border with Ukraine. We've gone into Ukraine. We meet with them at the border. I mean, we've been engaging on a very regular basis, and we have some elements of our team that are on the ground in Kyiv and have been there for the last month, and that will increase as time goes by.
So stepping back, why should we be doing this?
This is, one of the things that I've told people, and as I went out there, and as I mentioned, I went within a week of the war starting, was on the ground in southeastern Poland at the border, and I was talking with a lot of former colleagues and friends, and I just said I never thought I would be doing this in Europe again. Yeah. I've dealt with a lot of crimes in the Balkans over the years in different scenarios, but I really thought that we had moved past this point in Europe. That the integration that was going on, the breaking down of borders, the economic interrelationships, the demilitarization, all of these things were certainly on a positive trajectory. But this is really stepping back 100 years in mindset to this idea of seizing territory and gaining warm water ports and this kind of craziness, and at a huge human cost. And so if we're not going to stand up in a situation like this, we're really creating a free-for-all around the world. And going to the point that I made earlier also, that this is very different from other scenarios that I've encountered over the last 30 years where the government was either complicit in crimes or was at least compromised in some way in this. This is really a country that was a victim of naked aggression, and they want to defend their territory. They want to stand up for rule of law, and that means investigating and prosecuting these crimes, and we want to help them to do that. And I think that's important to do.
President Biden has spoken often about increasing the costs to Putin. He doesn't pretend that anything that sanctions would have stopped him from acting, but increasing the costs. There's a school of thought that if, after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, if the response had been stronger, like what we're talking about here, then just maybe it would have caused Putin to hesitate. I mean, I know we're all armchairing here,
Yeah.
but thoughts?
Yeah, I'm a believer in international justice, and obviously one of the things that we hope to accomplish through these processes is to have a deterrent effect down the line. It's very hard to gauge that and to determine whether you're actually making that impact or not. But when I started at the Yugoslavia Tribunal in 1994, the court was brand new. Very few people thought that it was going to succeed. I think most people believed that at best it would try a few camp guards and then kind of fade away.
Right.
What we saw, though, was that over time, the court was able to bring Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic to trial. We've seen in other processes around the world former heads of state that once would have been thought untouchable. People like Charles Taylor, Saddam Hussein, Ihsan Abre, Omar al-Bashir, either indicted or tried. So when you look at, this is a relatively short time frame. I mean, it's 28 years since really we had this rebirth of international justice. And we still have a long way to go, but the progress that has been made in this very short period of time is significant. And I have to think that political leaders at least have to have this in the back of their mind, that am I risking ending up in the dock? Clearly Putin felt like he was powerful enough and shielded enough that he would never face any sort of justice. He may be right in the long run, but he will certainly have a pariah status that will attach to him, and even more so if he's indicted. And so hopefully that does deter future actions like this, but it's very hard to gauge.
Well, and what we do know is if we don't try, then absolutely there won't be accountability.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Clint, it's great to catch up with you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
It's important. It matters. As I said when I began, this is an era-defining conflict, and hopefully we won't see its like again. But the only way that even has a chance of happening is if we pursue remedies and actions like this. So thank you. Thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you. My
Good
pleasure.
to see you.
Good to see you.
And that's been Hindsight Up Front, Ukraine. We'll see you next time.